The palace rose from the desert like a mirage made real, white marble and gold, surrounded by gardens that defied the barren landscape. Sheikh Omar al-Farsi had built it as a monument to his success, a testament to the billions he had earned through oil, investments, and sheer ruthless ambition. At 48, he was one of the richest men in the Middle East, feared by competitors and courted by governments. But tonight, alone in his private library, he felt none of that power. He sat at his desk, staring at an ancient scroll encased in glass, a treasure he had purchased from a private collector in Jerusalem for $12 million. The scroll was written in biblical Hebrew, a language dead for over 2,000 years. Scholars believed it contained lost psalms, possibly written by King David himself. If authenticated and translated, it would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the century. Omar had hired experts from the finest universities, linguists from Harvard, Oxford, Hebrew University. They had all examined the scroll, all offered partial translations, and all had failed to capture its full meaning. The ancient grammar was too complex, the vocabulary too archaic. Modern Hebrew scholars could read perhaps 60%, the rest remained locked away, its secrets silent. It haunted him. Omar was not a religious man. He had built his empire on logic and calculation, not faith. But something about the scroll called to him, a whisper from the ancient world that he could not ignore. He needed to know what it said. He needed to understand why it had survived 3,000 years to end up in his hands. His butler, Hassan, appeared in the doorway. "Sheikh Omar, the new housekeeping staff has arrived. Shall I conduct the orientation, or would you prefer to address them yourself?" Omar waved his hand dismissively. "Handle it. I don't have time for servants." "Very well, sir." Hassan hesitated. "There is one unusual candidate, a woman named Miriam. She comes highly recommended, but her background is somewhat unconventional." "Unconventional how?" "She is Yemeni, sir." "Jewish." Omar looked up. Yemen had once been home to one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, dating back to the time of King Solomon. Most had emigrated decades ago, but a few families remained scattered across the globe, preserving traditions that stretched back millennia. "Why is that a concern?" Omar asked. "It isn't, sir. I simply wanted you to be aware. I don't care about religion. I care about competence." Omar turned back to the scroll. "Process her with the others." Hassan bowed and withdrew. But something lingered in Omar's mind, a spark of curiosity he couldn't quite explain. Miriam Haddad reported for her first day of work before dawn, as instructed. She was 34 years old, with dark hair tied back in a neat braid, and eyes the color of amber. Her hands were calloused from years of labor, but she moved with quiet grace through the palace halls. She had worked as a maid in hotels and private homes across Europe and the Gulf. It was honest work, invisible work, the kind that allowed her to observe the world without being observed in return. She had learned long ago that the wealthy rarely noticed the people who cleaned their homes. It made them careless. It made them reveal things they would never reveal to equals. Her first assignment was the East Wing, guest bedrooms, sitting rooms, and the private library of Sheikh Omar himself. Hassan had warned her that the Sheikh was not to be disturbed under any circumstances, that he valued his privacy above all else, and that any servant who entered his library without permission would be immediately dismissed. Miriam acknowledged the rules and said nothing. For 3 weeks she cleaned the palace in silence. She dusted and polished and scrubbed, and she watched. She watched the other servants gossip about the Sheikh's moods, his loneliness, his obsession with the ancient scroll. She watched Hassan manage the household with iron efficiency, and she watched the library door, always closed, always guarded by an unspoken prohibition. Then one night, everything changed. Miriam was working late, finishing the East Wing corridor, when she heard a sound from the library, a crash, followed by a cry of frustration. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. Sheikh Omar stood in the center of the room, surrounded by scattered papers. The glass case that held the scroll was open. The ancient document spread across his desk. His face was flushed with anger, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, his expression turned to fury. "Who gave you permission to enter?" he demanded. "I heard a noise, sir. I thought something was wrong." "Get out." Miriam should have obeyed. Every instinct told her to bow her head and leave, to protect her job, to remain invisible. But her eyes had fallen on the scroll, and something inside her stirred, a recognition that went deeper than thought. "That's biblical Hebrew," she said quietly. Omar froze. "What did you say?" "The scroll. It's written in biblical Hebrew, ancient from the First Temple period." She took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the text. "The grammar is archaic, pre-exilic. That's why modern scholars struggle with it. The language changed after the Babylonian conquest." Omar stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. "How do you know this?" he asked. "My grandmother taught me. She was a keeper of the old traditions, the language, the prayers, the songs. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers, going back generations." Miriam met his eyes. "I can read this scroll, Sheikh Omar. I can read every word." The translation took 3 weeks. Miriam worked in the library every evening after her regular duties were complete, bent over the scroll with notebooks and reference texts spread around her. Omar watched her work with growing fascination. She read aloud as she translated, her voice giving life to words that had not been spoken in 3,000 years. The language was guttural and rhythmic, filled with sounds that modern Hebrew had softened or lost entirely. It was like hearing music from another world. The scroll was not a collection of psalms as the scholars had believed. It was something far more personal, a meditation on love, loss, and the search for meaning written by a king who had everything and yet felt empty. The author wrote of building palaces and acquiring treasures, of commanding armies and judging nations. But he also wrote of loneliness, of lying awake at night, wondering if any of it mattered. "I have gathered silver and gold," Miriam translated, her voice soft with emotion. "I have acquired singers and musicians, the delights of the heart. I have become great, surpassing all who came before me. But when I looked at all that my hands had done, I saw that everything was meaningless, a chasing after wind." Omar felt the words pierce him like arrows. He thought of his own palaces, his own treasures, his own sleepless nights. He thought of the wife who had left him years ago, the children he rarely saw, the emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. "Who wrote this?" he asked. "I believe it was Solomon," Miriam said. "The style is consistent with Ecclesiastes, but more personal, more raw." She looked up at him. He was the wisest and wealthiest king who ever lived, and he spent his final years realizing that none of it brought him peace. Then what did? Miriam turned back to the scroll, scanning the text until she found the passage she was looking for. "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. If one falls down, the other can help him up. But pity the one who falls, and has no one to help him up. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." She looked at Omar again, and something passed between them, an understanding that required no words. "He found peace in connection," she said quietly, "in not being alone." Omar told himself it was purely professional. He extended Miriam's hours in the library, because she was the only one who could translate the scroll. He provided her with better quarters, because she needed rest to do her work properly. He took meals with her because it was efficient to discuss the translation over dinner. But he knew he was lying to himself. He found himself thinking about her constantly, her voice, her intelligence, the way she challenged him without fear. She didn't treat him like a sheikh or a billionaire. She treated him like a man, flawed and searching, no different from the ancient king whose words she translated. "Why did you become a maid?" he asked her one evening. "With your knowledge, you could have been a scholar, a professor." Miriam set down her pen. "I was a scholar once. I studied linguistics at the Sorbonne, but my mother became ill, and there was no money for her care. I left school to work." She shrugged. "Life doesn't always follow the path we plan. Do you regret it?" "I regret that I couldn't save her, but the work itself," she shook her head. "No, cleaning is honest labor, and it gave me freedom, freedom to move, to observe, to remain unknown. There's power in being invisible." "You're not invisible to me," Omar said. The words hung in the air between them. Miriam held his gaze for a long moment, and he saw something flicker in her amber eyes, caution perhaps, or hope. "I know," she said finally. "That's what frightens me." The scroll's final passages were the most difficult to translate. The language became more complex, more metaphorical, as if the ancient author had been reaching for truths that exceeded the capacity of words. Miriam worked for days on a single page, crossing out attempts and starting over. Omar watched her struggle and felt helpless. He was a man who solved problems with money and power, but neither could help her now. All he could do was sit beside her, refilling her tea, encouraging her when she faltered. Finally, late one night, Miriam set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "It's done," she said. She handed Omar the final pages of the translation. He read them in silence, feeling the weight of each word. The ancient king wrote of a woman he had loved, not one of his many wives or concubines, but a servant girl who had come to his palace from a distant land. She had taught him her language, her songs, her stories. She had shown him that wisdom was not found in books or treasures, but in the human heart. "I have searched for meaning in wealth and in knowledge," the king wrote. "I have sought it in power and in pleasure, but meaning cannot be found. It can only be created, and it is created in the space between two souls who choose to see each other truly." Omar looked up at Miriam. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. "He loved her," Omar said. "Yes. And she loved him. The scroll doesn't say, but I think she must have. Otherwise, why would he have written this? Why would he have preserved it?" Omar set the pages down and stood. He walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit desert. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years, perhaps decades. "Miriam," he said without turning around. "I need to tell you something. You don't need to tell me anything." "Yes, I do." He turned to face her. "I've spent my entire life building walls around my business, my home, my heart. I told myself they were protection, but they were really prisons. And then you walked into my library and started speaking a language that has been dead for 3,000 years, and something in me woke up." He crossed the room and stood before her. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I don't know how to be vulnerable, but I know that when I'm with you, I don't want to be the sheikh. I just want to be Omar. And I want to know if there's any possibility, any at all, that you might feel the same." Miriam rose from her chair. They were standing inches apart now, close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her amber eyes. "I'm a maid," she said quietly. "I have nothing to offer you. You've already given me more than anyone else ever has." She reached up and touched his face, a gentle touch, tentative, as if testing whether he was real. "Then I feel the same," she whispered. They were married 6 months later, in a private ceremony in the palace gardens. There were those who disapproved. A billionaire sheikh and a Jewish maid, bridging divides of wealth and religion and culture that many believed should never be crossed. But Omar had stopped caring what others thought. He had spent his whole life seeking approval from people who didn't matter. Now he only sought the approval of the woman who did. Miriam continued her work as a translator and scholar, establishing a foundation to preserve ancient languages and make them accessible to the world. The scroll was digitized and shared with universities across the globe, its secrets finally unlocked after 3 millennia. Scholars hailed it as one of the greatest discoveries in biblical archaeology. But for Omar and Miriam, it remained something more personal. The text that had brought them together, the words that had taught them both what mattered. They had a daughter 2 years after the wedding, and they named her Shoshana, Hebrew for rose. Omar watched Miriam teach her the ancient language, singing the old songs, passing down the traditions that had survived against all odds. And sometimes, in the evenings, the 3 of them would sit in the library where it had all begun, and Miriam would read from the scroll in that ancient tongue, and Omar would close his eyes and listen. He had traveled the world. He had built an empire. He had acquired treasures that kings would envy. But it wasn't until a maid spoke to him in a language dead for 3,000 years that he finally understood what the ancient king had known. 2 are better than 1. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Wealth was meaningless without someone to share it with. And love spoken in any language was the only treasure that endured.